Good morning, everybody. The webinar will begin in 5 minutes. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we will be discussing interpersonal communication skills and how to maintain an issue focus during difficult conversations. My name is Patrick Allen, and I am the Program Manager for Kent State's Center for Corporate and Professional Development's Public Open Enrollment Programs. Our center specializes in providing employee development for partnering organizations in Northeast Ohio and around the country. We offer training as both public open enrollment programs delivered in Independence, Ohio, and also on-site customized programs delivered at your location. I am joined today by Kent State facilitator Deborah Easton. I will be serving as your host, and Deborah will be our presenter for today. Deborah has been a communications coach for over 30 years and provides audiences with practical and effective advice for communicating with colleagues, customers, and direct reports. Her techniques for one-to-one interactions and group communications provide participants with practical strategies for handling difficult exchanges. In addition to her enhancing interpersonal communication skills programs, she facilitates programs in both our open enrollment and on-site custom programs in areas such as coaching, accountability, communicating performance expectations, effective listening, and her always popular strategies for leading the multi-generational team. Everyone in attendance has been muted to avoid background noise from any of the over 250 registered participants. We do encourage you to ask questions at any point during the hour. You can submit your questions in writing using the control panel on the right side of your screen. I will present your questions to the presenter as time permits throughout the webinar. There is a handout available to you. It's located on the right side of your screen under the Handouts tab. If you'd like to print it out, it does have some notes about today's subject, and it'll help you follow along, and you can make your own notes on that. We are recording today's webinar, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording after we conclude our time together. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Deborah Easton.
Thank you, Patrick, and good morning to everyone. So out of all of the potential topics that we could discuss regarding interpersonal communication skills, it seems that this issue of maintaining a focus in a difficult conversation is the one area that people ask about the most. So I thought I'd start with some questions. Have you ever asked yourself the following questions? Why didn't I say what I was really thinking? Or even the opposite of that, which is, why did I say what I was really thinking? Or, what made the conversation get so off track? Sometimes we don't even realize it until 30 minutes after the conversation has ended that what we started talking about is not where we ended. And then how about the question, how did that situation get so emotionally charged? And maybe it's the other person's emotions that shocked you, or maybe it's actually your own emotions that shocked you in that conversation. So in our discussion today, in talking about maintaining an issue focus in difficult conversations, we're going to discuss the following concepts. First of all, the long-term impact on a relationship when a conversation diverts from the real issue. It would be nice if it could just simply be a short conversation with no residual effect. It can be if we stay focused on the issue, but when it diverts to other types of problems, well, that can have long-term effect. So we'll take a look at that first. Then we're going to talk about the most common ways that conversations lose focus so that we can recognize when a conversation is about to go off track, become emotional, get diverted from what the actual issue is. Then we're going to focus on what a real issue is. And keeping in mind the categories of what a real issue is can be very helpful then in redirecting the conversation to what that real issue is. And we'll talk about that as well. How, when it is going off track, how to get it back on track. As Patrick said throughout our discussion today, if you have any questions, or especially if you have any examples of something that we're talking about, please type those in. We'd like to have more of a conversation than just listening to me doing all the talking. So at any point you have any questions, please submit those. All right, so let's take a look then at the long-term impact of a conversation that diverts from the issue. All right, so at the beginning of any kind of conversation, there is some sort of issue that we are discussing. And as I said, we'll define what that is in terms of a couple of categories in just a moment. But here's the thing, if we don't keep focused on the issue, then what is going to happen is what I often refer to as we're going to go below the line. You'll notice that I have this do not cross the line surrounded in yellow. Imagine that like crime scene tape. You do not want to cross this line because on the other side is something I also oftentimes refer to as junior high. Have you ever had a day you were driving home from work and you said to yourself, okay, seriously, I know I was dealing with adults. I mean, we actually carded them at the door, but I swear I just spent the day in junior high. Oftentimes, people say to me, I'm amazed by how people get distracted by some of the silliest kinds uh, of of topics when we have so much to do on a regular basis as it is. So, how do we end up back in junior high? Well, I'll tell you, a couple of things begin to happen. The conversation becomes very personal, personal attacks. Then the next thing you know, people are rallying other people around them to prove that their point of view is more important than anybody else. And the next thing you know, you have those cliques of junior high occurring all over again. And at its worst, if we aren't able to redirect this conversation back to the issue, then we can end up in some undermining behavior. Oftentimes happens because one person feels like they lost in that conversational battle. So the last thing we want to do is have the long-term effect of this below-the-line kinds of circumstances. One other distinction here as you look at this slide is that above the line, the issue is where we're able to stay in that rational side of our brain. The below the line, those kinds of elements, well, that's the emotional side of the brain. And for any of you who have taken any of the emotional intelligence training, you know that everything we come into contact with during the day affects the emotional side of our brain before it affects the rational, which means that the tendency to cross this line is very, very human. And the ability to consistently stay above that line, well, there are times when that feels superhuman. So let's take a look at how we can avoid this below the line type of behavior. So, first of all, how does the conversation become personal? Well, as you can see here, we have those same 4 levels of the conversation getting into more of a conflict than it is a resolution of that conflict. So when we take a look at what makes the conversation personal, one of the first things that happens here is that we're starting to judge people. We're judging them. We're making comments like, you are so lazy. We're judging the person as opposed to talking about what the person's actual behavior was that made us so upset about them being lazy. Maybe they just got so busy that they forgot to unload the dishwasher today. But we're so frustrated by the fact that now I have to unload the dishwasher that we immediately jump to the judgment of that person and begin to, well, actually name calling. If you think about it, when I say to somebody, you are so lazy, that's actually a form of name calling. So again, you can see this is why I refer to this oftentimes as junior high syndrome. We kind of revert back to some of the behaviors that we had earlier in life. Now, here's the next thing that happens. No one who is feeling judged is obviously comfortable with that. So they're going to become defensive. And one of the most common ways people exhibit defensiveness is to start blaming other people. We make comments like, well, if you had given me better instructions, then I would have been able to complete this project on time. It's that diversion away from our own accountability, blaming other people for the uncomfortable situation. Sometimes this is a tactic that people use in order to divert away from the issue. The more they start judging us, the more they start blaming us, the more emotional we become. And I always describe emotion as like this fog that enters your head. First of all, it makes it very difficult to listen to anything but your own thoughts about, I am not lazy, and you're the one who's just being too critical of me right now. And once we get focused on all of that, we're not even listening to what's happening. We're not remembering what the actual issue was that started us down this path. Emotion is this cloud. It makes it very difficult for us to think. And now, there is one other element that oftentimes occurs here when the conversation has become personal, and that is that people's style becomes inappropriate. I mean, think about it. Just saying to somebody, you are so lazy, I'm not thinking about how I'm coming across. I'm just upset, and I want to make sure that they understand just how upset I am. And so under more calm circumstances, when I'm thinking more rationally, I would probably stop myself from utilizing that particular word choice. There's all kinds of examples of different ways people use inappropriate style. You may have somebody who just completely shuts down and says, whatever, and walks away. Or you may have someone who becomes more domineering in the conversation, interrupting, refusing to letting the person who starts the sentence finish the sentence. And so there's all different ways in which this inappropriate style can take place, even passive-aggressive ways, making a comment and then saying, oh, I was just kidding. Can't you take a joke? We've probably all come across someone who behaves in this particular way. All of this distracts us from what the real issue is and creates a very emotional conversation.
Yes, Deb. There was a question that came in. If the person's style toward me isn't appropriate, why not respond to them the same way to show them how they're behaving?
Okay, well, the problem, first of all, is that just because that person is inappropriate and is below the line doesn't mean that I should give up my dignity and allow them to pull me across the line with them. Because I'll tell you what, and you'll see this throughout our conversation, it can be very difficult the farther down we get to this list, especially when we get to the undermining level, to get it back up above that line again. It can take considerable effort. So why would I want to contribute to that happening? So that's my first answer to that question. My second answer to that question is this. When people have become very emotional, they are oftentimes not aware of their own style. They will storm into your office and demand to speak to you right then and there when you are obviously on the phone, perhaps talking with a customer. They're not even aware of where they are, what they are saying, or the fact that you have the phone in your hand. And I know that's oftentimes hard for people to believe because often they will say to me, oh, come on, you're going to tell me that wasn't a calculated action just to put me on the defensive? Oftentimes, no. The person is so emotional, all they can see and hear is what picture they have in their head of what's going on and hear what they're telling themselves about that situation. They may not even be aware of where they are in the room. And I'll give you an example of the most extreme situation I ever faced as a coach. It was a person who, when he was in a conversation and he wasn't getting his way, he would first of all become louder. Second of all, he would interrupt people. Thirdly, his word choice became much more judgmental of people. And then fourth, if he was really upset, he would shake his finger in people's faces. And this had gotten so bad that at one point he had actually poked a couple people in the shoulder. But the thing of it was, when he was approached with this behavior, his response was, I am not doing that. Everybody else is making this up so that I will back down from my opinion. And there had been actually one incident where one person said, okay, fine, you coming at me like that, I'm coming right back at you. So they poked him right back in the shoulder and shook their finger in his face. He had no idea that he was the one who had started it. All he saw was the other person's reaction to it. So let me put it one other way. Think about in football, when there is a fumble, there is a pile of bodies, most of them going for the ball. But once in a while, you have somebody under that pile who's just kind of punching and eye gouging and just irritating people. But when the pile disperses and people begin to stand up, the instigator of that punching stands up with the most innocent-looking body language on the field. Now, that's going to irritate the person who was punched, who will probably push the instigator. Now the referee throws the flag. And think about who that penalty will be against. The instigator? No. Referee didn't see it. But it will be a penalty against the reactor. And it's the same thing that happens if we just say, all right, if you're going to treat me this way, I'm going to treat you that way right back. Chances are the person didn't even know they started it, but they will make sure that other people are aware of how we reacted in that situation. So this is the danger, you see, of allowing the conversation to become personal. And think about it. If I have felt personally attacked, oh boy, there are going to be some grudges that are going to be kept. And the next time I interact with that person, I am going in with what the book the book Crucial Conversations, talks about tainted history. I'm walking in there already with this picture in my head of I am about to interact with a demon. So it's very, very important that we maintain that issue focus and do everything we can to keep this above the line.
Okay, had another question come in to ask, what if they come back to you in an aggressive way and you try to walk away, but they keep coming at you?
Okay. There's a difference between verbal aggressiveness and physical aggressiveness. And so let me take the physical part of it first. If in any way you are feeling physically threatened, get yourself into a safe position, meaning you find other people, you walk straight to HR, you walk into the manager's office. And it's a shame that we actually have to talk about that, but in this day and age, we all know we do. Now, secondly, the theme behind your question is, what if you are trying to remain rational, trying to stop the conversation, and the other person refuses to go above that line with you? This can be a difficult situation. I'm glad you asked. In this circumstance, the most important thing is to remain very calm and look at the person and listen to a point that's appropriate. But if, swearing is happening, the names that you're being called are totally inappropriate, then you say, this conversation is not appropriate. We can talk about this again in 30 minutes. And if you need to, continue to repeat that. This conversation has become inappropriate. We can talk about this again in 30 minutes. Now, I'm going to take that one step farther. For those of you who may be in a customer service role, and this may be the customer, this is a tough one because we like to believe that the customer is always right, but come on, let's be honest. They can be a real jerk about it sometimes. And so this is still something that for those of you who out there who may be in customer service, you and your colleagues and your manager all need to talk about where is the line that we draw in the sand, even with a customer that may be exhibiting this bullying behavior. But the key is to get yourself that time. If it's not quite that aggressive, perhaps your approach is to simply listen to what the other person is saying, paraphrase if you can what the issue is. Okay, you're obviously very disappointed at this moment. And they may come back and say something like, well, duh, you think? And that's okay. Say, all right, I get that. I'm really upset about this as well. And as a result, I just can't think straight right now. I need 10 minutes to collect myself, and then let's get back together again. It is okay to buy yourself time. Not everybody wants to give you that time, but give them a what's in it for them to give you the time. I will be able to better respond to you. I will give you a better answer if I can just have this time, this 10-minute time to collect myself. And then here's the key. Whatever time you ask for, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is, don't go hide and then never be visible again. At the end of that 10 minutes, ready or not, come back, because that's building trust. And all of this below the line behavior, there's no trust there. It's ruining trust. So think for a moment about somebody in your life whom you no longer trust. What would it take for you to give your trust back? I'm giving you a moment to think about that, because oftentimes when I ask that question and people are sitting in front of me, I see an awful lot of heads shaking no, that you may not be able to give that trust back. It's difficult. It would require a quality apology, someone acknowledging what they had done, how it hurt you, without making excuses for their own behavior, simply acknowledging, I screwed up. And then saying, this is what I will do differently from this point forward, and then they need to do it. So when these kinds of situations happen, this is the first step in rebuilding that trust, and then it simply requires consistency of that person staying above the line before we will believe that there will be that change. Trust is easy to break. It's very, very difficult to get it back. All right. Any other questions, Patrick, that you see?
No, not at this time.
Okay. All right. So you can see how just this first little step across the line can cause all kinds of problems. But it gets even worse, because nobody likes being in a personal conflict by yourself. So the next situation that occurs is that we start to develop factions. Now, how does that happen? Well, I start running around telling everybody about the altercation I just had with this individual. And why am I doing that? Because I need to feel more powerful. And the only way I can think to be more powerful, well, get other people on my side. The more people I have on my team or in my clique, the more powerful I am. But here's the thing, when we get focused on power, there's another interesting phenomenon that occurs, and this is where it gets really silly, and that is scorekeeping. This is the point at which people start saying things like, did you know they hired a new person and she got an upgraded computer? Oh yeah. I've been around for 10 years. What do I have to do to get upgraded equipment? Of course, I would complain about having to learn the new technology, but that's beside the point. Oh, and it gets worse. She got a desk chair with arms. It is amazing how much scorekeeping goes on when people feel like somehow they haven't had power in a situation. And once we get focused on the scorekeeping, who knows what even started it with the scorekeeping? So, before I make my next comment about scorekeeping, I want to throw this out there. I'd like you to type in some examples that you have seen of how people keep score in your work environment. Okay, now, while you're thinking about that, let me take this to another realm. You know, we keep score in our own families. We just came through Thanksgiving. I want you to think about scorekeeping at Thanksgiving. Well, we always have to drive the farthest to get to Thanksgiving. I mean, does anybody appreciate how far we have to drive? And why does it always have to be at her house? She's not exactly the best cook in the family, you know. So, what examples have you seen of scorekeeping?
Okay, Deb, we actually did have a few come in. One is that they hired a person and she does not have a degree. Employees use order tracking forms to determine who works the hardest. Her office is bigger than mine. what job assignments people get. And I like this one. Who has the warm office versus the cold office?
Very good. So you can relate to what I'm talking about here. Isn't it amazing how much time is spent based on what the score is? And people start looking at every little thing. For those of you who may be in any kind of a leadership role, whether it's a designated management role or you're in a designated team lead role, or maybe you're just the go-to person in your particular department, it's amazing how first everybody's watching you to see how you react in situations, and maybe they're keeping score of how much time you spend with one group of people versus another group of people. But in addition to that, the expectation is for those of you in that leadership role is that you are the one who's going to keep the score and who is going to make sure that the score is always even. And if it isn't, you're going to make it right. So there is that expectation oftentimes of leadership. Now, the worst thing that can happen here is that we're not aware of the scorekeeping that's going on. We're not addressing it, and I don't mean by evening the score necessarily. I just mean addressing it by bringing us back up above that line. If we aren't doing this, if all this stuff we've talked about so far has been going on for a long time, and that can be the case, then we're probably at the undermining phase. And undermining can take all kinds of forms. You'll notice I have two examples here. Just failing to respond to people. I get an email from somebody and I say, oh, look, it's from them. Well, they can just wait until the end of the day before I respond. Or sometimes in projects, people will take credit for things they didn't even have any impact on, or their impact wasn't positive, let's put it that way. So even not giving credit where credit is due can be undermining. So this is a danger, though, because once we get to this level, things get ugly or just plain stupid. Those of you who work in a shift environment, especially those of you who may be in manufacturing out there, you know that factions are built into the system. Those of you in healthcare, you see it as well. One shift is always mad at the other shift. The factions are built in with the shifts. Day shift is absolutely convinced that night shift sleeps the entire time. Night shift says, why do we always have to solve these problems? Day shift has management around during the day. Why couldn't they have solved this on their own? And so then you begin to see stupid things happen like, well, we are just going to hide the tools from them so that when they come in, they'll have to figure it out on their own. So as you can see, all of this below the line behavior is just absolutely ridiculous, but I'm pretty sure that all of you listening in have seen it happen in one form or another. It is very human because all of this stuff below the line is all of us engaged in that emotional side of the brain. Okay, so if that's what we want to avoid, then what is the actual issue? Well, in general, there are three categories of issues. And if we can just keep in mind these three categories and recognize in the conversation which type of issue we have, now we can take our power back and redirect the conversation. So the first category, as you can see here, is misinformation. Maybe one person just doesn't know what everybody else knows, or somebody got their information from the grapevine, and it's all distorted in some way. If we can simply keep focused on the facts, and not even the source of the facts. I mean, don't ask questions like, well, where did you hear this, and who told you that? You see, if I ask those questions, you see where I went? I went below the line to blame. Who's to blame for this? That's not the problem. The real issue is information is out there that isn't accurate. So what we need to focus on are those facts. I will say something like, oh, if that were really the case, I would be upset too. But this is what I know to be true. Or even asking, a question like, wow, how is it that you feel this may have happened, to get to kind of the mindset of that person. Notice I asked how, not who. How is it that this happened? And then say, oh, you know what? I was there. That's not what happened at all. If we can just straighten out the fact that we have misinformation, we can keep it focused on the issue. But think about it. You've probably had one of those conversations that went round and round and round for 10 minutes before somebody had the presence of mind to say, where is this coming from? And we realize the information is not accurate. Okay, so that's our first category. Now, second category is a difference of opinion. Now, this is where we allegedly have the same information, but we view it differently. And not to open up a can of worms here, but it's kind of like Congress. They allegedly have all the same information about the economy and crime statistics, but they have a difference of opinion of which of those issues is more important to discuss. And even when they decide one issue is important to discuss and everybody agrees on that, they still view it differently. And this can obviously be very, very difficult. Sometimes what we do in this one is we agree to disagree. But I'd like you to notice, as that information popped up on the screen, there's an and there. We need to plan how to act as a result of this difference of opinion. We can't just say, agree to disagree, and walk away. We haven't really addressed the issue. Here's an example. Let's say one spouse is a smoker, the other spouse is a non-smoker. We agree to disagree. But now we have to figure out how to live with this disagreement. Is there a room in the house where the smoker is allowed to smoke? Or does the smoker need to smoke outside on the back porch even when the temperature is minus 10 degrees? And what about if the smoker gets in the non-smoker's car? I mean, after all, it is the non-smoker's car. Is the non-smoker allowed to smoke in the non-smoker's car even though the smoker is in the car with them? You see how complicated this gets. But this is where we really need to focus our attention on the issue, is that we have come to an impasse. Maybe you and your brother-in-law are of opposite political mindsets. You may have to say to each other, is there anything I could say to change your mind? And the other person will say no. And you say, nope, nothing will change mine either. We agree to disagree. What's the plan? We won't discuss politics at every family dinner that we have. That's how we keep a situation like this above the line. But then we have this third category. And the third category is actually the most important because we're focused on the choice of action, not on the person themselves. If you remember my earlier example of someone saying, you are so lazy, you see how that focused on the person. Think about it. There are at least a dozen ways that a person could be lazy, that you could see them being lazy. It could be that they didn't unload the dishwasher. It could be that they slept in until noon, got up 8, went back to bed and slept until 5, got up at 8, went back to bed at 7, and slept till noon the next day. Maybe that's the choice of action that is your definition of lazy. But if we don't keep our conversation and our word choice focused on the choice of action and use something known as detachment, then you see what we have done is we have described the person as a whole, as though we're writing them off. Instead of saying, you know what, you made a choice that I really didn't appreciate, and it caused me some emotional pain, for example. What can be a better choice to prevent this from ever happening again? And we're using this mindset of detachment. I'm separating the person from the behavior. And here's the thing. We do this with kids all the time, but we don't do it with adults because we say they should know better. You know, you just painted your living room walls and your 3-year-old came along with permanent markers and added a mural to that freshly painted wall. You're pretty upset. But because it's a 3-year-old, you say, honey, Please hand me the markers. Okay, now here is the paper where you make your drawings. Here are erasable markers that you use. You're being proactive on that. And when you draw on the paper, we will then tape this to the front of the refrigerator. But the wall, that's not the choice. The paper, that is the choice. We do that with the 3-year-old. We need to do it with an adult. Okay, not with that same tone of voice, obviously. But the point here is when it's an adult, we say they should know better. I mean, common sense would dictate that they should know better. Okay, if anybody out there has a really good definition of common sense and how to teach it to people, I am all ears. My husband oftentimes says, you figure that out, Debbie, write a book on that and we'll be retired in Hawaii in no time. Usually common sense means the way I do it. So our focus here then obviously needs to be on an example of the behavior. Nobody will change that laziness, for example, if you don't offer the example of what isn't appropriate and what you need to see instead. Those of you out there who have tried to coach people, maybe you have what I referred to, if anybody was tuned in on the accountability webinar, as an EOR, a chronic complainer. You ever tried to coach a chronic complainer out of being negative? It's not going to work. Besides, we just describe them as negative. So we need to define how that negativity, what's an example of that behavior. In every meeting, they shoot down everybody's ideas, but don't have one of their own. That's an example of behavior. Question?
Yes, we did have a question come in. It says, we have transitioned to a more open work environment. How do you tactfully ask somebody to butt out of a conversation they are not invited to?
Okay, I like that one. Okay. Well, this is a good example of what we were just talking about, and that is choice of action. And it may be that what you want to set up first is a team rule, so to speak. I see rules of engagement oftentimes on a poster when I walk into conference rooms. And this might be one of the new rules, since you have just made this transition. Bring everybody together and say, you know what, we're finding that we're having to work through some things. And one of the things is, now we have an open environment, privacy has become an issue. And so we need to perhaps have a different choice of action. Instead of just overhearing a conversation and assuming I should have input to that, perhaps we should say, you know, I couldn't help but overhear. I do have a comment. If it's not appropriate for me to join the conversation at this point, just let me know that. And put words in people's mouths. You know, that's a choice of action, and make it very clear that it needs to be okay. If the answer to that is, no, not at this point. The two of us would like to discuss this alone. But we are now aware of the fact that you have input to this, and we will come to you. So again, it's all about that choice of action. It's much better than, as you see what just popped up on the screen, describing their attitude. You are so nosy. Or you think you need to be involved in every conversation. That's describing their motives. So thank you for that example, by the way. It just gave me a perfect example of that particular point. So it's really about the choice of action, and sometimes people need to be armed with specifics of that action, including word choice. So you can see that this is what the issue actually is all about. And obviously, we don't want to go below the line. This is very difficult to keep that kind of focus. There are times, even though I talk about this stuff all the time, I describe it as my out-of-body experiences. The trained side of me is leaving the entity known as Deb, and what's left is the emotional side of me that really definitely wants to go below the line. But it's only going to end up in long-term problems. So what do we need to do in those situations? First of all, keep in mind these three categories we just talked about. If I can identify that in the conversation, I know how to redirect it. Then what you're going to find is to ignore any comment that is a below the line strategy. Because if I can ignore that, then you can see what I can do in step number 3 is redirect it to the actual issue. But remember what we mean by a below-the-line strategy. Anything that's judgment, blame, inappropriate style, power, scorekeeping, or undermining in any way. Now, when I do redirect to the actual issue, sometimes people don't like it. They want to stay below that line. They want to keep it very emotional. So here's the strategy that you need to learn to do. Don't get baited by everything else now they're trying to pull you below the line with. You've identified what the actual issue is. Simply keep repeating that that's what the actual issue is. And I'll give you an example of this in just a moment. So, here's the thing. When their first below-the-line strategy didn't work, they will use another one if you have anybody who's a button pusher. Keep repeating the actual issue. All right, so let's take a look at how we do this. Okay, so here's an example. A colleague says to you, "I've worked here longer than anyone else in this department, including you. I think I've earned the right not to have to do any more grunt work, and this new reporting system is nothing but grunt work." Okay, so here's how we learn how to do this. Here's our example. Now, step number 1 is to pick out the below-the-line comments, and we're going to throw them out, okay? So let me give you a moment to look at that example. What are the below-the-line comments? All right, here's the first one. "I've worked here longer than you." That's scorekeeping. I'm not going to address that because that's an attempt at pushing my buttons. And if I acknowledge that my button has been pushed, I just showed how much fun I am to play with. Secondly, "I have earned the right." That's judgment. I've earned the right. It's a little bit of scorekeeping. And then thirdly, the word choice itself, grunt work, is judgmental word choice. So if I throw all of that out of there and you look back at the example, what's left? Well, so what we need to talk about is the new reporting system. That's what's left. That's what the real issue actually is.
Okay, Deb, we had another question come in. What if the person refuses to stay focused on the issue?
Okay, so supposing the person comes back at you and repeats that whole thing about, "Yeah, I've been around here for 25 years, you've been on the planet for 25 minutes. And they want to redirect it back to that whole scorekeeping about they've been around longer. If that seems to be a secondary issue, I may acknowledge that and say, "You do have experience." Which is why we should talk about the new reporting system from both of our points of view. But notice what I did there. I redirected it to the new reporting system. They come back and they say, "Yeah, you new people come in here with all these harebrained ideas." Well, then let's talk about your ideas for the new reporting system. You see how in repeating it, I become the brick wall that person just ran into. I am not going below that line. This is the issue, and I'm sticking with that issue. All right, so let's try a second example. A friend says to you, "I can't believe you were that inconsiderate." Okay, well, first of all, this is not even as specific as the first one. You have no idea what it is that you did that constitutes inconsiderate. You see, you're being described as a person, but there is no example of the action. Now, how do I handle this one? Well, the best thing for me to do here is to acknowledge the issue generally. You're obviously upset about something that has happened. Let's talk about the specific actions and talk about what to do next. Notice I didn't say here, "Why? What did I do?" Now, that's going to be our first instinct. And in many cases, that could be fine. But if you have a person who's a real game player, a real button pusher, and you say, "Why? What did I do?" their response will be, "I can't believe you don't know. Well, I guess we have bigger problems than I thought then, don't we?" So I'm acknowledging that they are upset about something. That's very general. I don't even know what it is yet, but I'm simply saying, let's talk about the specifics. And most importantly, what do we do next? Because how do we solve this type of issue? An issue that is an action? Well, we talk about what the substitute action is. We don't just complain about what went wrong. It's what went wrong and how do we fix it. Now, I'll tell you what, these two examples are examples of what I consider to be the most difficult communication skill that I teach. Because our first instinct is to fight back, is to get hooked by the emotional component of it. This takes a lot of practice. But what I just showed you is the best way to practice this. Maybe you have somebody in your meeting who constantly makes little sniper kinds of remarks to you. Well, think about what those remarks have been. What's the theme behind it? Where is it coming at you from below the line? And how can you redirect it to above the line? Sure, the next time you walk into a meeting, it's going to be a different topic, but you will recognize the theme. You'll recognize the strategy, and you'll recognize which category of issue you need to redirect it to. This takes practice, but it can be done. So when we are redirecting the conversation to the real issue, keep in mind the three general categories of what an issue is: misinformation, difference of opinion, choice of action. Ignore any comment that is a below-the-line strategy. Redirect to the actual issue. Now, this is hard. This means they might have said something that was very hurtful, but we need to make sure that we talk about that later. If it was hurtful enough that we need to discuss their word choice or their actions, we can talk about that later. But let's get the actual issue out of the way first. Remember to stay above the line by repeating that issue. And again, remember, when their first attempt to bait you doesn't work, they will use another bait. So repeat the actual issue. This is the way that we can maintain an issue focus in difficult conversations. Because, as I said before, all that stuff below the line, that's emotional. It can create grudges that can go on for years. It can make it impossible for me to really handle myself well in future conversations with that person because I can't get past the past. It's a trust issue. But the more we are able to stay above that line, we're focusing on trust. If you remember nothing else from today, remember this. If we approach every situation with one question in mind, is what I'm about to do, is what I'm about to say going to maintain or improve trust? It's probably the right approach. But if I'm to the point where I'm saying, I don't care how this comes out, well, I've thrown trust out the window, I'm more than likely below the line, and I'm creating future issues for myself. Because keeping an issue focused means you can walk away from the conversation confident that, first of all parties have been heard. Secondly, the trust in the relationship has been improved. Third, you have maintained your dignity. Dignity is above the line. And the real issue has been addressed, and you can move on with life. So I hope that this discussion has been helpful to you today. Think about interactions you have had. The easiest is to go back and, in your mind, at least have a do-over with what the actual issue was and how to redirect it. Anything that's ongoing right now, think about what the real issue is here. Not what it's become, but what it really is. Stay above that line, and good luck. All right. Okay, are there any questions?
Yes, Deb. We have a question. If you know someone on a personal level outside of work and you also work with them, how do you keep that separate?
Okay. Well, from my own experience as a supervisor, I ended up supervising people with whom I had shared an office for 6 years. And we actually had to have an issue-focused conversation and say, I'm in a different position right now, and there are going to be things that I can't talk to you about that we used to discuss in the office together. We used to discuss outside of work. But because of my position, I'm not able to do that. All right, maybe you're not their supervisor, but maybe what you do or the other people you interact with, you don't want to get caught up in your friends' constant gossip about some of those people who you need to go to a project team with. If that's the case, simply say, look, we are friends, but I can't talk about these kinds of issues because I need to work with these people and I need to be able to walk in without any preconceived notions when I go into the meeting, or I won't be able to be effective. So again, it's choice of action that you're focused on there, and why that choice of action is so important for you to follow.
Okay, thanks, Deb. We did just have one comment for you. It says great food for thought, and thank you. And unfortunately, that does conclude our time together today. I want to thank everybody for joining us. There was some really great interaction, some great questions, and great comments, so we do appreciate that. If you would like to learn more about today's topic, we encourage you to register for one of our upcoming programs that will be delivered on February 21st and also on April 2nd, 2019 at the Educational Service Center of Northeast Ohio, which is located in Independence, Ohio. You can see the registration link on your screen, and I do encourage you to register soon because these programs routinely fill. So get your registration in as soon as you can. We can also tailor any of our programs and deliver them for you on site for your team. You can join our extensive list of clients and bring Kent State to your organization. You can contact us at 330-672-3416 or email us at yourtrainingpartner@kent.edu. We also encourage you to register for our next webinar, which is a discussion about motivating employees with Kent State facilitator Scott Tackett. In that webinar, we will be reviewing the 5 key behaviors that every manager must engage in on a daily basis. And for those attending live right now, you will be asked to complete a short survey. Please complete this survey so that we can be assured that we are bringing you the most usable and relevant content possible. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Kent State Center for Corporate and Professional Development and our facilitator, Deb Easton, thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day and a happy holiday season.